Even in the long run, Pombal's policies were not fully effective. Although he reduced Portugal's trade imbalance with England during this period, Brazilian trade suffered because the demand for its products on the world's market remained low. This was a classic problem for the American colonies. Their economies were so tied to the sale of their products on the European market and so controlled by policies in the metropolis that the colonies' range of action was always limited. Although Pombal's policies were not immediately successful, they provided the structure for an economic boom in the last 20 years of the 18th century that set the stage for Brazilian independence. Reforms, reactions, and revolts. By the mid-18th century, the American colonies of Spain and Portugal, like the rest of the world, were experiencing rapid growth in population and productive capacity. By the end of the century, Spanish America had a population of almost 13 million. Between 1740 and 1800, the population of Mexico, the most populous area, increased from 3.5 million to almost 6 million, about half of whom were Indians. In Brazil, the population reached about 2 million by the end of the century. This overall increase resulted from declining mortality rates, increasing fertility levels, increasing immigration from Europe, and the thriving slave trade. The opening of new areas to development and Europe's increasing demand for American products accompanied the population growth. The American colonies were experiencing a boom in the last years of the 18th century. Reformist policies, tighter tax collection, and the presence of more activist government in both Spanish America and Brazil disrupted old patterns of power and influence, raised expectations, and sometimes provoked violent colonial reactions. Urban riots, tax revolts, and Indian uprisings were not unknown before 1700, but serious and more protracted rebellions broke out after that date. In New Granada, present-day Colombia, popular complaints against the government's control of tobacco and liquor consumption and rising prices as well as new taxes led to the widespread Communero revolt in 1781. A royal army was defeated, the viceroy fled from Bogota, and a rebel army almost took the capital. Only tensions between the various racial and social groups and concessions by the government brought an end to the rebellion. At the same time, in Peru, an even more threatening revolt erupted. A great Indian uprising took place under the leadership of Jose Gabriel Candequí, known as Tupac Amaru, a mestizo who claimed descent from the Incas. Tupac Amaru led a rebellion against bad government. For almost 3 years, the whole viceroyalty was thrown into turmoil, while more than 70,000 Indians, mestizos, and even a few Criollos joined in rebellion against the worst abuses of the colonial regime. Tupac Amaru was captured and brutally executed, but the rebellion smoldered until 1783. It failed mostly because the Criollos, although they had their own grievances against the government, feared that a social upheaval might take place if they upset the political balance. This kind of social upheaval was not present in Brazil, where a government attempt to collect back taxes in the mining region led in 1788 to a plot against Portuguese control. A few bureaucrats, intellectuals, and miners planned an uprising for independence, but their conspiracy was discovered. The plotters were arrested, and one conspirator, a militia officer nicknamed Tiradentes, was hanged. Despite their various social bases, the movements indicated that their activism by governments increased dissatisfaction in the American colonies. The new prosperity of the late 18th century contributed to a sense of self-confidence and economic interest among certain colonial classes, which made them sensitive to restrictions and control by Spain and Portugal. Different groups had different complaints, but the sharp social and ethnic divisions within the colonies acted as a barrier to cooperation for common goals and tended to undercut revolutionary movements. Only when the Spanish political system was disrupted by a crisis of legitimacy at the beginning of the 19th century did real separation and independence from the mother countries become a possibility. Global connections, Latin American civilization, and the world context. In 3 years, Spain and Portugal created large colonial empires in the Americas. These American colonies provided a basis of power for their Iberian mother countries and took a vital place in the expanding world economy as suppliers of precious metals and certain crops to the growing economy of Europe. By the 18th century, the weakened positions of Spain and Portugal within Europe allowed England and France to benefit directly from the Iberian trade with American colonies. To their American colonies, the Iberian nations transferred and imposed their language, laws, forms of government, religion, and institutions. Large numbers of immigrants, first as conquerors and later as settlers, came to the colonies. Eventually, the whole spectrum of Iberian society was recreated in the New World as men and women came to seek a better life, bringing them their customs, ideas, religion, laws, and ways of life. By government and individual action, a certain homogeneity was created, both in Spanish America and in Brazil. That seemed unity was most apparent among the Europeanized population. In fact, despite the apparent continuity with Spain and Portugal and homogeneity among the various colonies, there were great variations. Latin America, with its distinct environments, its various economic possibilities, and its diverse indigenous peoples, imposed new realities. In places such as Mexico and Peru, Native American cultures emerged from the shock of conquest, battered but still vibrant. Native American communities adapted to the new colonial situation. A distinctive multi-ethnic and multiracial society developed, drawing on Iberian precedents, but also dependent on the native population, the imported Africans, and the various mixed racial categories. Argentina with few Native Americans, Cuba with its slaves and populations, and Mexico with its large rural indigenous populations all shared the same Hispanic traditions and laws, and all had a predominantly white elite, but their social and economic realities made them very different places. Latin America developed a composite civilization distinct from the West but related to it, combining European and Native American culture and society, or creating the racial hierarchies of slave societies in places such as Brazil. The empires of Spain and Portugal in Latin America bear comparison with the Russian Empire that had formed at about the same time. While Iberian expansion had taken maritime and Russian expansion over land, the process of colonization and the conquest of indigenous peoples created many parallels, including the development of coastal labor. The creation of all these empires also demonstrated the impact of gunpowder, but the cultural impact of the West was different in the Iberian and Russian empires. Whereas the Russian rulers had decided quite selectively what aspects of Western culture to adopt, in Latin America, Western forms were often simply imposed on the populations, but not without resistance. The American colonies of Portugal and Spain also bear comparison with those of the English, French, and Dutch, who first converted the Iberian possessions and then created their own empires, sometimes at the expense of the Iberians, but often following their own models. The empires of Portugal and Spain were global in reach, but the American colonies became part of an Atlantic system that promoted continual interchange between Africa, Europe, and America for goods, people, culture, and ideas. This, too, was a pattern that other Europeans followed. From the perspective of the world, Sorry, I'm going to reread that sentence. From the perspective of the world economy, despite the ultimate decline in production of precious metals, Latin American products remained in great demand in Europe's markets. As Latin Americans began to seek political independence in the early 19th century, they were confronted by this basic economic fact and by their continued dependence on trade with the developing global economy. Latin America's world economic position, with its dependent and coerced labor force and outside commercial control, revealed its colonial status, but in its often bitter history of cultural clash and accommodation, a new civilization had been born. That is it for Chapter 19.